Hello and welcome to the video lecture on words and pictures for the magazine publishing module. In this video, I'll be talking about some tools you can use in analysing words and pictures of magazines. I'll talk you through a sample and give you an example of the kinds of things you might get out of this kind of analysis, and I'll introduce the readings that I'm suggesting to go with this topic. First of all, some underlying definitions. These might seem a bit like they're not precisely related to the idea about words and pictures, but they're things I want you to have in mind as we're thinking about these kinds of analysis. So ideology as a means of legitimising existing social relations and differences of power simply through the recurrence of ordinary familiar ways of behaving which take these relations and power differences for granted. And discourse, language as social practice determined by social structures. Now you've heard me say those, you might be starting to think about how they do connect into this study of words and pictures as applied to magazines. And I'm thinking here of magazines as an example of one of those ordinary familiar ways of behaving, or as a source which depicts some of those ordinary familiar ways of behaving and helps to reinforce the kind of ideology that Fairclough is talking about in this. Magazines are also, of course, an example of discourse. You've almost certainly heard that idea before. So magazines are a social practice, and they are determined by and in turn help to determine the social structures around them. You'll certainly have heard me or Alex or Leander or somebody give you a version of that idea before. The relationship between magazines and society is mutually constructed. The one constructs the other in turn, like the chicken and the egg. And all of this always has discourse and ideology going on behind it. Even things which seem superficially to be straightforward have had ideologically informed decisions happening behind them, although not necessarily, and indeed not usually, consciously on the part of the person making those decisions. So keep that kind of idea in the back of your head while you're looking at analysing the words and the pictures involved with magazines. There's always some ideology going on, and they're always acting as an example of discourse, of the way that discourse interacts with society and helps to constrain society. So that points towards the idea of critical discourse analysis, which is one of the tools that I find particularly useful to look at the language that's happening in magazines. And what it's doing really is helping you to step away from your immediate common sense understanding of what words mean, and to look at things like why this particular word was chosen instead of a different one, what the connotations of that word might be, and what kind of underlying ideologies are going on there. So Makin and Mayer here say, CDA typically analyses news texts, political speeches, advertisements, school books, etc., exposing strategies that appear normal or neutral on the surface, but which may in fact be ideological and seek to shape the representation of events and persons for particular ends. The term critical, therefore, means denaturalising the language to reveal the kinds of ideas, absences, and taken for granted assumptions in texts. This will allow us to reveal the kind of power interests buried in these texts. And I've got an example of text. They're just sort of a selection of magazines I drew from the piles of magazines that are in my house. And possibly some of them are familiar to you, probably most of them aren't. But they're all conveying particular ideas about their reader and where their reader belongs in society in one way or another. And sometimes it's a bit hard to actually see those, to kind of take the step back to think about what's going on here, which is why, in fact, why I chose this quote, because it makes a point of defining critical as being denaturalizing. It's trying to get you to kind of take a step back, try to forget the things you usually assume about these kinds of texts and these kinds of images, and to look at what's going on behind them. So taking a slightly different angle to looking at what's going on the page. But again, this does, as with all of this links in with ideas of power hierarchies, if only in the content on the page. And it's ideas about how people read. Now, you may have come across this before. These two diagrams are taken from the website mentioned at the bottom of the slide here, and I do recommend you go and read the article because it's short and it's accessible and it's really good about the ways that people read. The first of these is the Gutenberg reading order, which says that people start at the top left-hand corner and basically tend sort of more or less down and to the right to end on the bottom right-hand corner. And they might read a bit in that strong fallow area in the top right. They probably won't read very much in the bottom left corner, the weak fallow area, and they're sort of generally moving down and to the right. The second one, the Z reading order, does what it says on the tin. It agrees that people start at the top left and end at the bottom right, but it suggests that the order that people read it is more or less Z-shaped. Now, these two things don't actually disagree to a great extent. They're both defining a similar sort of left to right, top to bottom order. Now, obviously, that is specific to languages like English, which read left to right and top to bottom. There are, of course, other languages with different reading orders, and they'll have corresponding patterns that will be slightly different. But you can use this reading order to get ideas about what the magazine layout artist thought was important on the page when you're analysing other people's magazines. And when you're starting to create your own magazine layouts, you can use this reading order to influence the way that people read things and to influence the order that they look at things on the page, to give them information about priorities and so on. And you'll quite often see that the most important information is in that top left-hand corner, because that's where people's eyes first land. Now, if you read this article, you'll see that the author gives a lot of emphasis to the idea that this is when all information is structurally and hierarchically more or less similar, and that you can also influence that with the way that you place things on the page. So, for example, you put a heading in a particular spot, or an image, or a striking pull quote, you can pull people's eyes around. So again, things to bear in mind when looking at analysing the ways that magazines are presented, and when you come on to creating your own magazine layouts, to remember that. Now, this is just a snippet from the McLaughlin chapter that I recommend you read along with this, this unit, and it's looking at the way that the page is structured. So this is drawn from research by Cresson van Leeuwen, with not completely widespread support, but it's a useful lens to use to look at the way that information is presented. So the first of those diagrams is a two-page spread, where typically, assuming that the two pages are part of the same article, you will find the given information, that is the information that you already know or assume, on the left-hand side of the page, on the left-hand side of the spread, and the new information on the right-hand side of the spread. Now, obviously, there are many, many exceptions to that, but quite often you'll see the kind of thing where perhaps you get the large glamorous photo that introduces an interview on the left-hand page, and then on the right-hand page you'll get an interview which perhaps starts to get into some new and unexpected information about the person being interviewed. That's an example of the given and the new. So again, that's a lens you can use to look at the information. Similarly, the dividing of a single page up into the ideal at the top and the real at the bottom. This comes from an analysis of adverts, of full-page spread adverts, where the top of the page, and remember the top of the page is where the eye typically starts, will give you the perhaps slightly glamorized image of whatever the product being sold is, and then towards the bottom of the page you'll get the more practical, technical, realistic kind of information that supports that image. But it's the glamorous, the ideal at the top that pulls you in, and then once you've been pulled in by that, then you get the real, the more grounded, more concrete information. So keep those kinds of lenses in mind. They won't analyse all of the magazine spreads you see, but sometimes they'll be a useful hook to kind of hang an idea on. So I wanted to give you an example of the sort of analysis that we're doing here, and I'm going to give you some other magazine covers and contents pages to look at in the seminar activity to do this kind of analysis for yourself. in my next slide, I've got a word of caution about the use and limitations of this analysis. But for now, let's take it at face value. So what we have here is an issue of O Comely magazine from 2014. It's still being published. I went and checked yesterday, but at the time it was one of a sort of newish breed of women's magazines that was trying to break away a bit from the kind of what you might typically think of as like the Cosmos and so on of this world. But you don't need to know that. You can draw all of that information from analysing the way that the words and the pictures are presented on the page here. So to start with, let's look at that cover. Title typeface. I don't know if it's actually hand-drawn, but it certainly wants you to think it's hand-drawn. It's a handwriting font, if not hand-drawn, actually. To me, that reads as friendly and whimsical. We've got the model on the cover with her kind of cute waifish look. She's got messy hair and she's wearing makeup, but it's faux natural makeup. She's got a tattoo, but it's probably not a tattoo. It's probably actual pressed flowers stuck on. So it's kind of whimsical rather than extreme. The tagline there, "We can be heroes." The theme of the issue is heroes, but as it's stated here, it's almost a call to arms. Excuse me. The reader, as demonstrated by the model on the cover, might be young and pretty and cute, but she can also be a hero. So taken like that, maybe it's a kind of feminist statement. And if we look at the table of contents from the beginning of the magazine, superficially, it's a formal grid structure. It's quite a serious sort of. It's very structurally composed. It has solid lines at right angles, which is normally the kind of thing you might see in a more serious sort of publication. In this case, something about the images undermines that kind of formality and structure, because the images are all a little bit off in one way or another. They make the whole structure less formal. They're all a bit weird, a bit kind of slightly odd angles. In some ways, the best example of that is the wide one on the second from bottom level with the number 92. It's an image of a person, but instead of being shaped around the person into maybe a tall portrait orientation, it's a long, thin landscape orientation, which is an odd choice for that particular image. And they're all a bit like that. And it's also not at all obvious how each of these images relates to the article it's linked with. And I don't know how much you can see that on the video, but the numbers on each of these images relate to the page number of a particular article. But for example, the first one in the top left-hand corner for page 42 is linked to an article that's described in the contents list as being X Lee, portraits of what it means to be free, which doesn't actually help to shed any light on what that image in number 42 is. And the image itself doesn't help to shed any light on what the article's about. So they're all helping to create this kind of this overall image of being a bit whimsical, a bit dreamlike, a bit kind of soft focus and airy and drifty. We can see the categories on the contents page structuring that contents and telling us what's important. So we've got art, heroes and people as the kind of the most important aspects here, and everything else comes under and. There's some interesting keywords coming from the titles and descriptions of the articles, which seem to me to be defining the mood. Sketchbook, legendary, playful, toys, unicorn, cold Brighton beach, meditations, magic, metamorphosis, making bread, bath bombs. And while any individual pair of those might be a bit of a weird combination, for example, making bread and bath bombs don't necessarily seem to belong together particularly, that group of words and phrases together creating a definite and strong mood, which is the same sort of feeling as being created by the images and by the cover. Now, there's lots and lots of other ways that the layout artist could have done this. None of these articles are obviously kind of classic women's magazine topics. For example, there's no makeup, no romance here. They could easily be repackaged for a general lifestyle magazine or a literary and music magazine. It could be targeted at bright children or old people or middle-aged women. And it's the styling and the layout and the design and the word choices that set the target reader of this magazine. So let's talk about the ideal reader. Now, if you haven't encountered this before, the ideal reader is the one who is most squarely being targeted and addressed by the magazine, which isn't to say that all of the readers will be this reader, or indeed that any of them will be. But the ideal reader is the one who perhaps only implicitly and subconsciously the magazine has in mind as being the person who it's talking to. So in this case, and I'm interpreting this from what I see in front of me with this contents page and this cover. I'm not using any extra information at all. I'm just reading it from there. So the ideal reader is clearly a woman. She's probably in her 20s. She probably doesn't have any kids. Her romantic relationship, if she has one or more, is not really very relevant to the discussion. I'd say she's a bit alternative. Probably not very alternative, but not really interested in mainstream fashion or beauty in conventional ways. She's probably arty and creative, well-educated, middle class, maybe working in a creative industry or being crafty in her spare time. The real reader, probably most of them are not all of those things. So it's interesting to think about how that works. How alienated might the real reader, who is some but not all of those aspects, feel? A real reader who shares most of those characteristics but maybe differs on one or two might feel quite comfortable within this magazine. A real reader who differs on too many of them might start to feel a bit alienated, a bit like this magazine isn't really for them. Depending on which aspects they are different on and how far they're different, the magazine might feel aspirational. So there's kind of different relationships here going on between the magazine, the ideal reader, and the real reader. And some of that stuff you can start to analyse just by looking at the magazine and reading it. Now, I said back at the beginning that you need to keep in mind the political, ideological aspect of these things. And on the face of it, there is no politics and no ideology behind this magazine. It's a kind of a cute, whimsical magazine for a young woman who thinks of herself as being quite creative. But everything is political. The positioning of this woman reader is political. I said when I was talking about the ideal reader, I think she's probably not very interested in her appearance in a conventional way, but nevertheless, the woman on the cover is pretty. Her arm is decorated with flowers, which is a conventionally feminine method of decoration. And I said I think it's probably not a real tattoo, because that helps to kind of soften that image. If it was a full arm real tattoo, that would give a different kind of impression. The word comely in the magazine title itself means pretty. It means pretty in a sort of old-fashioned kind of way, and it's obviously not very invested in prettiness, but prettiness is right there in the cover. So even though there's nothing in here about makeup and beauty and so on, there's still the overall impression that the woman reading this should be interested in prettiness. She's signed up to this kind of wistful, dreamy aesthetic, and she's being encouraged to be interested in higher things like art, and not troubling herself with the grubby everyday stuff. Again, you probably can't see this in the contents page, but the articles in this issue include one about an eating disorder and another one about a recently split up couple cleaning the apartment they're moving out of, both of which might seem like they're examples of the grubby everyday. But in this case, both of those articles are told with this same kind of soft focused prettiness. So this magazine is one that can publish an article about an eating disorder and make it wistful and dreamy. And that to me is political. That's saying something about the concerns of the woman who reads this magazine and the kinds of interests and things that she should be expected to be giving her time and energy to. It's not encouraging eating disorders. The article is not positive about them, but it's also not a hard-hitting tale of reportage looking at the damaging effects of eating disorders on people's bodies or minds. So there's lots of other ways that we could present this information, these topics, to appeal to different audiences and to serve different aims. Now, I said there were going to be some words of caution. There is no such thing as objective truth in this kind of analysis. You might disagree with some of the things I've just said in my analysis of O Comely. That's okay. Your interpretation is valid. But in the academic context, when you're thinking about these things in seminars, writing about them in your essays, we need to see your evidence to support your argument. You can advance any argument you like as long as you've got some evidence to support it. So there's lots of different ways that you could have read the things that we looked at in the previous screen, the cover and the table of contents of O Comely. I would guess that on average, probably most of you will see the same sort of things as I saw in it, probably. But of course, I would say that because that's what I see in them. Some of you will have seen slightly different things or have different interpretations, and that will probably be true in the seminars when you're looking at other examples of magazines as well. That's all right. Different people will interpret things in different ways. And there's some which some people will find more compelling, others which fewer people will find more compelling. You might have seen people complaining that a particular interpretation counts as overthinking it. We'd much prefer you overthink to underthink. And some of the aims of things like critical discourse analysis are to uncover the ways that people tend to underthink, by which I mean to uncover the ways that we assume the meanings we're familiar with and don't bother unpacking what they actually mean. We, on this course, want you to unpack this stuff. We want you to take a step back and look at it critically. Learning to do that will serve you well throughout the course and beyond, although I don't promise it will make you any happier once you start unpacking and nitpicking all of these things. So I've recommended as reading to go with this unit, The Language of Magazines by Linda McLaughlin. It's a handbook that's available on the library website. We've got an ebook version of it. It skims you quite quickly through lots of different methods of analysing the language and the appearance of magazines. And it's a really useful starting point for some of this. Getting into more kind of peer-reviewed academic journal articles, definitely start with Gerard Jeanette. There's several different ways you can get into his thinking about the paratext. I've suggested one here, but we've also got library access to his book Paratexts, and he's got an article in Caroline Davis' book Print Cultures, if you've got that kicking around as well. Paratext is he applies the theory mostly to books, well, entirely to books really, and in that reading it's about all of the stuff that the publisher adds to the text, so things like covers and end papers and the way the title is presented, and the ways that reviews and copyright information and so on are put into the book, and the choice of typeface and the ways that the illustrations are presented, all the stuff that's not just the text. So his discussion of it is not directly about magazines, but you'll find loads of useful ideas in there which you can apply to magazines. The O'Regan article is useful as an introduction to critical discourse analysis, and I've recommended that one in particular because it's quite accessible, and it includes an actual analytical structure that you can take and use in your own work that gives you questions to ask about a text and kind of guides you through things to look for in it. And finally, the Talbot article gives you an example of this kind of critical language analysis applied to a magazine. She's just looking at language rather than image, and as you might expect from my particular interest, it's on a teenage magazine, but it's a really good example of this kind of analysis. So those are the readings I recommend, and those are the references I've used in this article, in this video rather. Thank you very much.